My trauma story can really be summarized by my mom and I. I'm an only child. My mom was a single parent, had a really significant, complex trauma story of her own. And so my mom created a world where I was her everything. I was her entire world for the first 10 years of my life. Everything we did centered on me. There was a lot of, I think, parentification, but also me kind of being the person in place of a partner for my mom. And again, not conscious to her, but looking back, I think there were a lot of dynamics that were created that I didn't quite know how to engage in the world as a kid.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Flip That Shit. My name is Stacey Uhrig. I'm your host, and today's guest is Kyira Wackett. Let me tell you a little bit about Kyira. We're going to get right into it. Kyira is a licensed mental health therapist. She's a facilitator and a creator. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband, Jordan, and her daughter, Everly. She's the owner of Adversity Rising, where she equips people with the confidence and skills to write their own story. She also sees patients in a private therapy practice treating eating disorders, anxiety disorders, and trauma, which is where I think you guys know we're going to be jamming out a lot. She's been speaking on topics related to mental health and well-being for over 10 years and focuses on balancing insight and action to create meaningful and sustainable change. Her specialties are in communication, boundary setting, distress tolerance, forgiveness for self and others, and cognitive reframe and empowerment. She believes that all of us have the capacity to author our own stories and relinquish the holds of shame, fear, and anxiety if we can learn how to do the hard work, sit in the discomfort to face our true selves, and trust the process. So welcome. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Me too. Thank you.
This is going to be great. I want to dive right into this, Kyira, just as I do with all of my guests. And I really see this part of our time together to be the beginning stages of this understanding of how a trauma client can become a trauma practitioner and a helper and a healer. So I'm going to just open it up and have you just say to me, what was your challenge growing up that was trauma for you?
Yeah, it's always interesting because, when we have traumatic experiences and sort of complex trauma, whenever you ask somebody to put it into words, they're always like, wait, my mind is 7,000 balls just got dumped on the floor. Where do I start? How do they connect? What do you do? So it's interesting, even years into my trauma recovery process, how that still feels like that's the case the instant someone asks that question. I think a lot of my trauma story can really be summarized by my mom and I. I'm an only child. My mom was a single parent. Mom had a really significant, complex trauma story of her own. I didn't know it at the time. We didn't find out till I was in high school, but she was also living with undiagnosed bipolar disorder, which had a pretty significant effect on our life overall. She was never meant to have kids. She was told she would never carry a baby to term. She had had 3 miscarriages, a stillborn. So she had a lot of, I would say, codependency and sort of enmeshment vibes with me when I was born. She didn't quite understand how to have the healthiest relationship, partially probably with her own mental health stuff, probably some of her own trauma, but also the sort of relief, I guess I'm thinking what the word would be for her. I don't want to speak for her, but when she's told something she'll never have, she's grieved it her whole life. And then she had me. And so it was very much this polarizing feel for her. She kind of jumped to this other end. And so my mom created a world where I was her everything. I was her entire world for the first 10 years of my life. Everything we did centered on me. I made pretty much every decision. There was a lot of, I think, parentification, but also me kind of being the person in place of a partner for my mom. And again, not conscious to her, but looking back, I think there were a lot of dynamics that were created that I didn't quite know how to engage in the world as a kid. And then my mom, when I was about 10, might have been 11, She was a nurse. She got her nursing license when she was pregnant with me. Prior to that, she struggled with a lot of substance use, a lot of issues with sort of sexual boundaries in nature, and just a lot of things that, anyone that sort of ever read a textbook about bipolar disorder, my mom struggled with that. Hypersexuality, spending, drug use, a lot of ways to try to manage the brain in maladaptive ways. She ended up forging prescriptions to get Vicodin. That was her drug of choice because Vicodin in her brain worked very similar to cocaine. Cocaine was her primary drug of choice. So when she would take a Vicodin, if anyone else has ever taken one, after your wisdom teeth or something like that, you get sleepy, you get groggy. For my mom, it was like a high. She would go like she just took a hit of cocaine. And pretty much that was the beginning of a crumbling of my world as I knew it. And so when this happened, there was a lot of detail pieces that come in and out, but basically sort of the summary point of my mom got to a position where she was offered she could go to treatment instead of jail. And her nursing license was temporarily revoked with the idea that she would go through this rehabilitation process. Honestly, all in all, the best possibility one could have for someone that struggled with mental health and substance use. She wasn't immediately thrown in jail. She was given opportunities. She wasn't able, ready, willing, whatever it is, to take them. So she went through some programs. But eventually she found herself on the street. She was back using crack. She was struggling more and more. So she never returned to nursing. She never returned to being in a home with me. So I kind of equate that right after my birthday, right after I turned 11, she left. And that was kind of the last time we had sort of a quote unquote normal life. And then for about 10 years, it was her in and out of treatment centers, jail, and then eventually prison after she struggled really severely with her substance use and ended up breaking into our home. We didn't know it was her at the time. There was a man that was with her. But we found out later on it was her, and she'd broken into my home with me and my grandma to steal her purse. And my grandma decided to press charges, which was really, I think, hard for her. My grandma passed away last year, and it's been a really interesting thing just reflecting on their relationship and now having a daughter who she's only 3.5, but realizing the hard choices sometimes you have to make as a parent to be the help your child actually needs. Yeah. But that was hard. And she had me begging her not to do that. And, please don't let that happen to my mom. But my mom ended up going to prison for most of my high school years. And now I can say that was the best thing that ever happened. Yeah. That's where she got diagnosed with bipolar disorder. That's where she actually got some treatment, some support. I wish that was like the fairy tale sort of ending, is then she got the help. She got what she needed. She transitioned back out into society. She was able to manage it. We still had another 7 or 8 years where she struggled with drug use. She struggled with a lot of other things. She's now sober. She's, I would say, in a position where she's still trying to learn what her recovery process is. But when I think about all of that, and kind of in the midst of this, I had moved in and out of family homes, had a lot of trauma. My grandma became really suicidal. I had to kind of put her in a mental health facility for a while. What I've learned, and what I think I knew then, but I never knew anything different, because again, I kind of grew up being my mom's sort of partner and parent, is I basically lived my entire life parenting my mom and my grandma. My grandma was struggling with her own stuff, but still trying to help any way she could. She was definitely solid for me when I needed it. But I spent most of my life doing that and then learning how to be perfect so no one else never needed to take care of me. And hence, for anyone else that's had that experience, that's sort of the trauma response system, is be so okay that, one, it's protective, so nobody knows your pain because that's too vulnerable. You don't want to deal with that. 2, never be something that deters away from everybody else you have to take care of. And so that really kind of became my foundation point. And I would say the biggest part of my trauma recovery, obviously things like a break-in, seeing my mom, picking my mom up from drug houses, having to, go to court when she went to prison. And those things were traumatic. But I think the most traumatic thing long-term was it's been over a decade of me learning how to be in relationships with people where I don't develop codependent relationships or relationships where I am always a little bit above them in terms of power, because that's the only way to be safe and to protect them.
I have so much in my head to unpack. You talked about all the balls coming down on the floor. I'm like, voraciously. I know. So I'm going to write something down here. So, okay. Before we get into talking about what trauma really is, right? Mm-hmm. Because I want it always to be clear. It's never the event. It's the way that it impacts our life and the inferences and the interpretation. But I actually want to talk about your mom for a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, 100%.
So, you were talking about complex PTSD. I don't think people understand the difference between C-PTSD or complex PTSD and PTSD. The term PTSD gets thrown around a lot, right? So if somebody feels super triggered in a circumstance, they're going to say, oh my God, I totally have PTSD from this.
Right.
And I think it's really important, if we're going to do this series together, really educating people. So we start right there. So in your opinion, professional opinion, what is the difference between PTSD and C-PTSD, or what's known as complex PTSD?
Yeah, I love that. And I will even back up and say that that's a thing that even there's resistance and a lack of information even in the helping community, because C-PTSD is not its own diagnosis in the DSM. And so I think a lot of people don't even, on the practitioner side, fully understand what this means and the differences of it. It's kind of like how everything was just sort of autism. Everyone has this, and now we understand that it's a spectrum of experiences and what that looks like. And so now I think we understand that there is something that happens. So when I think about trauma, and there's obviously, we could go big T, little t, and I'm sure people that are listening to this have heard that before too. When we think about trauma, there's a sort of base level understanding of what a traumatic event might be. So we think about major things like losing your home in a natural disaster, sexual abuse, rape. There's these big things that could happen to somebody that automatically we all sort of code that as that would be traumatic.
Right.
When I think about big T, I think about the things we've sort of universally or at least culturally accepted that anyone that hears that's going to go, that's trauma. The little t traumas, in my opinion, are the things that might hit at that same level as a big T, but not everyone's going to see it that way. So it's something that someone else might be like, well, that doesn't feel like it's that big of a deal, but it was to you. Like when I got in a car accident when I was in my master's program, and somebody hit me with a stat of like, well, I think it was like 50% of everyone driving a car in the US is going to get into some sort of major accident in their life. And it was like, what do you want me to do with that information? And then they're like, well, nothing really happened. You got to go home. You didn't have any major issues. You got all the money. You got a new car, like people trying to make it better. And I was driving in winter in Wisconsin, which anybody that has ever driven in wintry conditions, it's not great. And sort of the expectation, like I should be fine because everyone goes through this and it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. But that was so traumatic to me. It took me months to be able to drive. And even now, I mean, we're 12, 13 years out, I still have to go through my sort of hypervigilant responses, and I have to like navigate how to not let myself get keyed up to get into a car when there's going to be snow on the ground. So that's kind of how I think about trauma. Now, when we think about what it does to the brain, and again, what you're describing, which is it's not necessarily the event, it's the way that your brain experiences it and your body experiences it. And I kind of, I guess, hit on that with the accident. But what I think about is essentially, if your brain is going in a direction, when you experience trauma, part of your brain gets kind of shattered and then sent into different directions, and it doesn't quite know how to move forward. And now there's this vigilance that's created, a sort of distrust of yourself, a distrust of the world. There's a change. It's almost like somebody smeared your glasses, and no matter how much you work, you can never get that smear off. You can't unsee whatever happened.
I always say it changes the filter through which you see life.
Exactly. So if somebody has PTSD related to a specific event or a series of events that happen, but it sort of gets categorized as sort of one experience, one unit. Think about that. But I think I'm getting older. I'm getting more floaters. I don't know if you have those, but like the little floaters in your eyes. Well, I've gotten more recently. And I went and saw my eye doctor and I was really panicked. And he's like, I think it's just age, that you're at a point where some of them happen. I'm not concerned about it. And you will adjust to them over time. You will learn how to see without them bothering you as much. So with somebody that has PTSD, as they're working their recovery, they move through it, provided there aren't any more major big T, little t trauma events, they start to learn how to see through that smudge. It gets integrated a little bit more. They learn how to navigate through it. It still is housed in the body. There's still a cellular change that happened in the body. There might be certain things that key them up. Fireworks, loud sounds, that's a big one for people long term, even if your trauma had nothing to do with a loud event, but just something that triggers you to hypervigilance. But if while you're learning how to deal with that smudge, somebody comes and wipes a new smudge, and then there's another smudge, and then there's another smudge, and you're constantly kind of jarred with the fact that you can't predict when the next smudge is going to happen and how it's going to affect you. Your brain never has any time to sort of recalibrate and to get a steady state again. So now it's sort of the snowball effect. And I think about kind of action potentials in the brain and neuronal firing, where when your neurons fire, they need time to recharge, to come back up to baseline. For somebody that's experienced complex PTSD, basically think about it like the neurons being expected to fire because there's constantly a signal. There's constantly something that could happen without that rest state. So your brain is acting in the red all the time.
So would you say also, and I love your version of, I talk about big T, little t all the time, and maybe you'll like this analogy. I came up with this the other day. Like you said, big T are the things that everybody would look like and be like, oh, that must have been traumatic, right? So I say, if you're talking about weather patterns as an analogy, anybody that hears about a hurricane or a tsunami or a tornado or a massive flood is automatically going to think that could be really traumatic. But somebody that lives in the Pacific Northwest who has rain for 6 months straight, or maybe it's even just a mist where there's just a dampness all the time that is going to affect everything around you, may be equally as impactful to the person, because that might make them feel trapped. That might make them feel lonely. That might make them feel down. To me, that mist of the constancy of dysfunction, like it wouldn't be normal to have rain for 60 days or even for 6 months. It's that constant mist of dysfunction and abnormal that is kind of like that little t. So nobody really looks at it as though it would be necessarily traumatic, but it can equally have this tremendous impact on somebody.
Yeah.
C-PTSD, is it fair in your mind that C-PTSD, which is also known as complex PTSD, really also is a series of events that change that lens through which people see themselves and others in the world around them, but in an early developmental stage? Where they're learning, a young child, say before the age of 12, where there's this intensity and this extra duration and this extra frequency of either the big T or little t events. But because we don't have the language and we don't have the rational brain, we're overloaded with feelings and stress responses that sometimes are even pre-verbal that really navigate how we end up coping with life, right? Because it's what basically causes us to believe certain things about ourselves, others, and the world around them. And that's that lens that we're talking about that now you navigate life through. So I always see C-PTSD often as this complexity because it's happening before you can rationalize. And it's this consistency of developmental trauma, developmental needs not being met, and or these big T traumas happening, versus I sometimes see PTSD as like an acute trauma, like a car accident. Or, an act of aggression or an act of violence or an act of abuse that doesn't really connect to something else that had happened at another time. What's your feeling about that?
Yeah, I think two things came up when you said it that I think are important. So one, I don't know if you've read the Bell Hooks book, All About Love, but she talks about in there, one of the problems where people get confused about what's love and what's abuse, because we accept a lot of things as love that are actually abusive, is the normalization of dysfunction and how that gets coded in the brain. So I think one of the key things that you're describing, so 2 points of it. One, when let's say that somebody experiences trauma when they're 30 or 40 or 50, and that's their first time experiencing some sort of major traumatic event, they have years of resiliency and skills developed to manage some of that upheaval, as well as I think what you're describing, sort of the cognitive awareness, hypothetically, the emotional insight, although we know a lot of people are learning that in their 30s, 40s, 50s, because they didn't have that as a kid. So there is that piece. The problem, I think, with CPTSD that's hard to suss out as the practitioner, but also as the client, is your normal is rooted to these traumatic things. So when somebody grows up, I just watched, it was a few years old, I think, but it's the 7-year-old that she gave a TED talk, and she talked about how like the most amazing things you can do to help children before they're 5. Now, if you think about brain's development and what's happening during those times, what we call critical periods of development, when traumatic events happen during those critical periods of development, the brain basically, if you think about that kind of like moving, shattering, displacing, it can't go through those developmental stages in the same way as it would have previously. So there becomes sort of an accumulation of, I think, lacking development sounds negative. That's not at all what it is, but different.
It impacts normal development of the brain.
It's an adaptive development to traumatic experiences, I think. And so that adaptive development becomes their normal. So for me, having gone through, there's a lot of trauma I had before I was 11 years old. I just I didn't recognize it until I've been doing my own therapeutic work and even seeing other things. And there's stuff even that my husband and I, when we talk about with my daughter, his life growing up, where I'm like, that's not normal. Like that's not how things were, or vice versa. Even then the association of, and I see this with people all the time, I had a 2-parent household. Everything was fine. I had all my needs met. I didn't have anything traumatic. There's no reason for me to struggle and have such difficulty in relationships but I was fine. And that goes back again to that big T, little t. And I like your missed idea of, but let's talk about how you had to adapt to existing in the room with those 2 parents.
But again, if you don't know, look, we only know what we know. We only know our normal. And by the way, if we've adapted well enough, we might not feel hypervigilant, or we might feel that hypervigilant is our baseline. That was me. Hypervigilance was my baseline from the age of like 11 until 41, you know, because I learned it, and I never felt like it was okay to turn it off subconsciously. So, you know, Gabor Mate, who I love, who I'm sure we'll talk about, you know, he has this great book, and the title of it is The Myth of Normal. And I love that title because, like you said, first of all, we gaslight ourselves all the time. Well, I grew up 100%. In a 2-parent household, and, you know, there was no abuse or aggression or violence in my home. So like, I mean, it was fine. It was fine. Yeah. I'm fine. And unless you're willing to get under the hood and say, but what is it about it that maybe wasn't fine? Because, you know, here's what I see. We have such a small set of like really important needs as a child, right? Keep me fed, keep me hydrated. I need structure over my being so I know I'm safe from the elements. I need to be kept clean, right? All these things tell me I'm important and I matter, but I also, they're to survive, but I also need to know I belong.
Right.
And so often part of that mist of dysfunction is maybe you're growing up in a household where you had 2 parents and everybody worked and there was money and there was no abuse or aggression or acts of violence, but they were completely either immature and you were the one parenting the parents, right? Or completely emotionally unavailable.
Yeah.
And you're not really getting the affection, which is sending you this signal of maybe you're not worthy of it, or you're not deserving of it, or you're not enough. It might not even be said, but it's inferred, right? That's the trauma. So getting back to the C-PTSD versus PTSD, obviously there was something in your mom's growing up, I'm assuming, where she had what you would consider a complex PTSD.
Yes.
Life early on, which we can talk about intergenerational trauma on a whole other episode. But what's not lost on me on the story, and the reason why I wanted to ask if it was okay to continue to talk about your mom, is two things. Number one, it's so important for people to understand that things like incarceration, drug abuse, homelessness are a symptom of something. Nobody chooses that shit. You know, nobody chooses to be an addict or chooses to be homeless. It's often a byproduct of having a set of actions in our life from this lens of unworthiness, undeservingness, feeling very not enough. And I'm really curious for you with the bipolar diagnosis, because sometimes I've read that, you know, there's nothing in the DSM-5 that really talks about trauma other than PTSD, right? As a symptom or as a diagnosis. And sometimes I hear from people that they feel like a bipolar disorder or even borderline personality disorder is often misdiagnosed because C-PTSD is not in the DSM-5. So what's your feeling? Like there's nothing that they can attach it to. And so therefore this is the one that fits the mark the best. But yet could all of the things in that checklist that give somebody the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder really be unresolved developmental trauma?
Yeah, I definitely think so with personality disorders a lot more often than not, particularly because we know even with BPD as an example, so borderline personality disorder, trauma is a part of the diagnostic criteria, that there's often some form of traumatic experience, insecure attachment. So I do think there's a lot of those pieces. I think the problem with diagnoses is the stories we write with them, because there's a lot of times where I'm like, does it really matter if you had that one or the other one? But the reason it matters is if somebody has CPSD, they're given sympathy. If someone has BPSD, they're feared, judged, and rejected. So I think the differentiation matters from the standpoint that the value we've placed on certain diagnoses changes someone's experience in the world. When I had to give somebody a BPD diagnosis, that was hard. And a lot of practitioners will shy away from that. They won't talk about it. They'll just sneak it into their chart, which is the worst thing you can do for somebody that has attachment insecurity. And so a lot of it is having some conversation around what does everybody believe this is versus what does it actually mean, which is essentially your brain and body has such an insecure attachment to the self and to the world. You don't know how to engage in relationships where you see that you will ever be chosen. So you're constantly playing a game of trying to be enough, pulling them in. And then the instant you feel like that could get lost or taken, you reject them for protection. So it's recognizing that those things are a reaction to how we show up in the world. And so I think for my mom, I do genuinely think knowing enough about her history that bipolar was an appropriate diagnosis, because even when prior to 18, she had these really intense highs. She has these periods that she would get to where it was a full-blown mania. So she has bipolar disorder 1. So she's had manic episodes where you would see somebody that has that. So it can be substance-induced mania or true mania, which is the brain not having the ability to regulate itself. She has experienced that from everything I have understood, how she's engaged, and then some of those really intense behaviors. But the tricky thing is, I think sometimes then that becomes, at least for her, as soon as she got the diagnosis, that is how she led her life, is through that label. And then practitioners, people played into that. So now it's, well, she's medicated. She's not using crack. She's not on the street. She's not a danger to society. She's fine. But she was on so much Seroquel at one point that I was like, how is this a fine life? How are we treating the pain, the trauma? She still has trauma. She still has these other things, but we don't see it now. And that's the one downside, I think. Because it's numbed
down from the Seroquel.
From the medications. And so then and then it's me as the therapist saying, I don't want to be your therapist or your parent. I've been doing that for my whole life. And this is fucked up.
Yeah.
This is not okay that we're basically medicating you to the point that you're just existing. And she's starting to do different work. And that's been the painful side on me, is I can't do that for her.
Right.
And part of making the decision about having a relationship with someone and healing my own trauma, finding forgiveness with her, is giving her the space to live the life that she is choosing to live, even if I don't agree with it. And so that's been an interesting dynamic. But with her, I do think bipolar disorder matches. And I think she also has a co-occurring CPTSD and an OCPD, so obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which, if we were to dive into that, I also think is a result of her insecure attachment and trauma and her need to find some semblance of order and control, because she spent her life being told she wasn't wanted.
Right.
And that belief of, if
I'm
I could
not
just
enough.
Exactly. And so if she believed that, and we walk it into now her as my mom, she is going to want me to never feel that way. And she didn't know how to do it. So similar to someone like with BPD, like we're describing, where their dynamics and relationships are off, my mom only knew what rejection felt like.
Oh gosh.
And feeling like she wasn't wanted. My grandmother blamed her for why she was stuck in a loveless marriage, why she was the oldest of 5 kids, and how she was trapped and she couldn't get out of it. My grandpa died before I was born, so I never thought of him as my grandpa, quote unquote. So my mom's dad struggled with substance use, a lot of power in a small town. He was a superintendent. There was a lot of dynamics. But my grandma's, and this is intergenerational trauma, I know we're laying the seeds down for a future episode. My grandma's trauma and her own stuff that was never dealt with then played into how she treated my mom. And then my mom, in turn, developed a very codependent and enmeshed relationship with me that even now, when I'm almost 36, I'm still having to navigate with her. Hey, that's not an appropriate boundary for a mother and daughter to have. We need to talk about what that looks like. But she's learning through me at 70 what she deserved to learn when she was, if we go back to your CPTSD, what she deserved to learn when she was a kid, to develop safe and healthy boundaries. And she didn't. And now at 70, it's still disruptive of how she shows up in the world.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I'm going to actually end the episode right there.
Okay.
Because it's either going to be 30 minutes or it's going to be 90, right?
I love it.
So
Yep.
I think we just laid such a good foundation for whatever series of conversations we're going to have. But I think it also lays a foundation for people. My main mission with this platform is to help educate people with low and no cost resources so people can start to understand this idea of stuckness and what trauma really is. So what we're going to do in the next episode, because you just said, but my mom still has the trauma, right? Even though she has the medication and the this and the that. I really want to dig into what that really is. Like, what is trauma? So if people are really interested in this episode, stay tuned for the next episode, and we'll get right into it. So thanks for listening, and we'll be with you guys soon.